So hi again, everyone. This is AJ Ehrenstein, Dean of Beyond Barnard. We're here for day 3 of our introduction to the consulting industry. Today, we're talking about coffee chats, informational interviews, and behavioral interviews. And I'm just kind of excited to talk a lot about how to build your network out. This is a topic that I cover a lot in my advising with students. How do you essentially navigate the creation of a community of support, particularly in the consulting industry, an industry that really values your capacity to build meaningful relationships for I think lots of reasons. But I hope today's conversation can be helpful to you no matter what you ultimately do. I think when it comes to building communities of support, particularly as Barnard students and alumni, there really is no industry that doesn't value your capacity to connect. And there really are no best practices today that I'm talking about with respect to consulting that couldn't be modified for your creation of network, your exploration of possible connections, your coffee chats, which are really informational interviews, and even some of the things that I'll talk about with respect to behavioral interview strategies, that is preparing for what we typically think of as normal interviews. Tomorrow we'll talk about the case. All of this can be adapted to other industries. And I think it's one of the things that makes it really valuable to participate in things like consulting recruiting in the fall, because all of the things that we're talking about today, and really yesterday with job documents too, can be best practices that you take into your recruiting activities no matter where you end up actually being interested in working. So just rehashing the learning goals for the entire week, Monday and Tuesday are behind us. Today we're talking about behavioral interviews and coffee chats. Tomorrow cases, Friday, meet the consultants and alumni panel. Should be a small and mighty group at 2 p.m. Eastern. So no need to wake up super early or super late for those of you on the West Coast. And I know we have at least one. Today, what are we expecting? I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll be able to plan effectively for informational and behavioral interviews based on just understanding what to expect in those two very different, but I think related contexts. Like I said, I'm going to focus a big part of the first section of the conversation today on how to build out your network, how to use particularly social networks to reach out to alumni, to establish meaningful connections, and to actually build relationships that could be helpful to you personally and just like good to get external perspectives on your trajectory as a Barnard student, but also very practically in the context of consulting work. And then I'll do some fun work on charting answers to some common behavioral interview questions. I do think that in the consulting industry recruiting process specifically, students tend to over-prepare for case interviews and underemphasize the importance of behavioral components of the recruiting process. It's still really important that you prep the answers to these questions to convey that you're the kind of person that they want to be on long trips with throughout the week, that you are the kind of person that will feel comfortable at client lunches, that you're the kind of person who's just interesting, who does cool stuff, who's had experiences that are valuable to you, who has interests that are outside of just consulting and casing and your academic courses, but that also, of course, that you are committed to intellectual work in your courses as well. So our agenda, we'll start with building your community, move on to planning for an informational interview or coffee chat. I'll talk a little bit about why coffee chats and consulting informational interviews are so structured as compared to other industries. I'll help you plan for behavioral interviews, and then we'll open it up to questions. And today we happen to be a small group. For those of you watching at home, you may not know this because you can only see me. But since we're a small group, we may go off recording and just have a kind of small group discussion for questions to give some folks who made it to the event some time to air some specific concerns that they may have. Okay, so building your community. I left this, I did a different presentation on networking for students in the sciences, but I saw this slide today and I was like, man, I just love that dog so much. So I had to leave him in. So who is in your community? And I'd like to open this topic of conversation by emphasizing that you should think about your community as a series of concentric circles or a dartboard. If you're interested in consulting work, then right at the heart of this red circle here may be a second-year associate consultant at Capco who's interested in financial services consulting, who shares your major, who even maybe grew up in Austin where you're from, that person is right at the heart of your set of affinities. As you're building your community, you're going to try to identify different shared affinities or interests with individuals that you're trying to reach out to. However, that's not to say that the person in this second tier, who may not be at Capco, a firm that you're interested in working at, who might be at Strategy and or McKinsey or Bridgespan, but who maybe shares your major and isn't from Austin, but is from the South or is from Texas, and obviously goes to Barnard, that person may be very, very interesting to talk to as well. This third ring out here may be an individual in consulting, not at a firm you're interested in, but maybe shares your identity group. Maybe in their LinkedIn profile, they identify as African-American or first-generation low income. Maybe you'd like to discuss with them the challenges and opportunities that are attendant to your particular shared identities when it comes to exploring opportunities in the consulting industry. So maybe they didn't study what you studied, but maybe they can provide advice about shared backgrounds or other shared affinities. I always kind of joke that the person in the outer rim here is like a Columbia dude when it comes to Barnard students, but no joke, you should definitely think about Columbia alumni, men and women and everything in between, as part of your network of connections, as part of your series of concentric circles. The object is not at the beginning to hew away people that don't belong to the universe of people that you could contact as part of your community, but to really draw as expansive a map as possible, and then to determine who you want to reach out to at each stage. I should say when you're thinking about this, and I'm going to go back to a slide that I used on Monday, that individuals at all stages in their career are part of your community as Barnard alumni. And I think that the most important starting point that you might not be used to using, maybe some of you are at this point, maybe some of you are new to this process, the most important thing to really think about as Barnard students is that Barnard alumni are all automatically in your community. This is one of the magic things about social and cultural capital, right? That just by virtue of being at Barnard, you share a very important and for many people fundamental affinity. That means that you shouldn't feel shy. I hate to say that, I'm sorry. I know we have self-declared introverts on the call this week, and some of you may identify as shy as well, so it's okay to be shy. But I don't think that you should think it problematic to reach out to individuals at all stages of their career, especially if they are Barnard alumni. The affinity that you share with those people by virtue of having gone to Barnard is one of the most important in a person's intellectual and personal formation. I also really find it very common that individuals are intimidated to reach out to people like Lorena Yee here, who's going to be one of our Insight speakers. She is a Chief Inclusion Officer at McKinsey & Company. She's also a senior partner. She's one of the key figures out on the West Coast in the San Francisco office. She is a big deal. There is no doubt about it. But oftentimes when people get very senior in firms like McKinsey and others, they stop hearing from really engaged, smart Barnard students. And it's kind of a bummer. It's always kind of a delight to hear from someone who's reaching out to you on the basis of shared interests and on the basis of a shared identification with your college. And at a certain point, you don't want to be intimidating. You want to hear from 19-year-olds who can refresh your energy and enthusiasm for your work. You want to hear from a senior who's a psychology major and thinking about how to translate her work in behavioral psychology to consulting. I want those conversations. And so I really want to encourage you today to think, when you're thinking about your series of concentric circles, it's not just the most recent consultants hired into the firm who are worth reaching out to. It's often senior people that you can feel comfortable reaching out to. I should add, though, that specific to consulting and a couple of other industries, but I see this more often in consulting than elsewhere, more junior individuals are often compensated based on their recruitment activities. So think back to what consultants do. They identify solutions to problems and find efficiency wherever they can. And one of the places that consulting as an industry has really found efficiency is in leveraging affinities and shared alumni connections as a means of getting good people pre-qualified into the recruiting cycle. That means that sometimes junior consultants are actually required to participate in informal seeming networking activities. So it could behoove you to reach out to more junior people. They may be recruiting liaisons for Barnard. They may be specifically compensated if someone from their network is hired into the firm. This is really smart on the part of consulting firms. Sometimes people balk and they're like, oh my God, that's so gross. And actually what it is it's firms saving money on big recruiting staffs by essentially leveraging their existing employer network to bring in good people from top institutions like Barnard. So again, the key point here is Barnard alumni are all part of your community, and you should think about reaching out to Barnard individuals across their career span. All right, how do you get started on this? And I'm gonna say the L word, LinkedIn. Ugh, I know. I always make a joke that Millie is the scariest mascot in the history of college mascots. It's like the most terrifying bear costume imaginable. Like my wife and I were driving in Woodstock, New York. We got lost a couple of weeks ago, and I was kind of pissed off because we got lost and we were driving around. We didn't know where we were going. I looked to the left and we both go, ah! And there was just a bear. There was a bear, like a majestic bear. And it was not as weird looking as Millie. Anyway, that's my bear story. 3 ingredients to get started with a strong LinkedIn profile. The first is a picture. I will circulate this evening to everybody who registered for this program tonight, a program that's dedicated specifically to LinkedIn best practices that is led by Karen Baruch and Ankita, I can't remember her last name, I'm so sorry, about LinkedIn best practices. And there's a substantial amount of data that shows that profiles with pictures get engaged with at a much higher rate, similar to cover photos. So I don't think you need anything fancy here. I like to add something that says something about myself. So I work at Barnard. I love Barnard. My picture is Millbank Hall. That is not me in the Millie costume, but this is my LinkedIn background. And the last part is a summary. So as a potential consulting candidate, what I think you want in a really strong summary is essentially a 4-sentence or 4-part introduction to your work. The first provides your essentials of your academic background. So I'm a junior at Barnard College studying biology and dance. I'm specifically interested in the way that the biology of the human body structures possibility for aesthetic representation in dance. I don't know, I'm just making this up, right? So you want 1 to 2 sentences that lay out your Barnard College affiliation and your intellectual work. The second sentence should be something having to do with how you've mobilized that work in professional or potentially research experiences that demonstrate some of your specific skills. So with previous internships in X, Y, and Z, or at Barnard, I have pursued multiple opportunities to lead student organizations like A, B, and C. You want to transition from a general overview of your intellectual work into something that's specific about how you've mobilized skills in a professional or extracurricular capacity. The third sentiment you want to share is what you're interested in pursuing. So I'm especially interested in general strategy consulting firms and have a passion for helping clients deliver value across industries. That's where you want to go next. Or I'm pursuing internships at a range of boutique consulting firms with a special focus on healthcare consulting. So saying something about where you're tending. So you want to tell the reader who you are, where you're at now, and where you're going. The last part, and you'll always be able to tell which Barnard student has met with me because I always insist on them adding this, is I'm always open to connecting with Barnard alumni, specifically from, and you can, if you're really interested just in consulting, you can say specifically in the management consulting industry. You can say specifically who share my background in psychology and dance or biology and dance, as well as work or previously worked in strategy consulting. You don't have to say that part. I really think that being broad here is totally acceptable. I'm always happy to connect with Barnard alumni, particularly those who are from New York. You could say whatever you want. It doesn't even have to be any narrower than that. And the final sentiment is reach me at Barnard email address. And I like to emphasize it's good to put your email address in your LinkedIn profile because it makes it really easy for people to reach out to you. LinkedIn is notoriously difficult to communicate back and forth on, and email inboxes are always easier. All right, so how do you actually do this when you are interested in connecting with consultants specifically. So I'm gonna do something different here, and what I'm going to do is I'm gonna actually open up a LinkedIn browser, or an internet browser, and walk you through my typical process for connecting with individuals on LinkedIn. A couple of different ways of doing this. First of all, so I'm going to show you the first way is to go to linkedin.com/school/Barnard College. And I'll put that in the chat in case you would like to follow along really easily. So this is basically your landing page for all Barnard alumni. And you can see that there are 20,000 plus alumni from Barnard College who are in LinkedIn. What I recommend from here is you decide where you want to go. So I think if you're interested specifically in consulting, you want to first go to this alumni tab. This is going to allow you to search for alumni. And I'm not sure if consulting makes it all the way to the top. Oh, it does. So consulting is one of the top 15 industries among Barnard individuals. And so when you go to what they do and you scroll down to consulting and click, you will now have filtered below the profiles of individuals who are Barnard alumni who identify themselves as being part of the consulting industry. And you may recognize some of these faces. This is exactly how I found some of these folks for the presentation itself. Right, so this is a great way to start from a general perspective. Like, you're interested in learning the names of more firms. Okay, well, great. Come over to the alumni tab in the Barnard LinkedIn account or the Barnard LinkedIn page and take a look at all of the different places where people are working as consultants. So let's take a look at Tatiana. Okay, great. She's an associate consultant at CRE. Maybe I didn't know what CRE is. Now I have, you know, the option to add a new firm to my list, and it happens to be a nonprofit organization management firm. So it's a nonprofit consultancy. Neat. Didn't know that, but I can start figuring out more firms by searching by the consulting industry from Barnard's LinkedIn home. You can also filter not only by industry, so go back to consulting, but then you can drill down into specific firms. So we've got 13 folks who indicate they're in the consulting industry and at Accenture. So let's say you're interested in applying at Accenture. This is one of the ways that you can start searching for Accenture. But let me show you a different way of going about it. Let's say you're looking at Handshake and you see that there are opportunities coming up at Accenture. I would start in the search bar, searching by Accenture in quotes. And I really do that because using Boolean search terms, that means that if you put what you're searching for in quotes, then the search results will produce the entire string. So if I searched Boston Consulting Group in quotes, I wouldn't get someone from Boston in a group who's maybe in consulting. I would only get people from Boston Consulting Group. Filtering this way, start with Accenture, click People, and then you're going to go to All Filters and search for Barnard and apply. And this way, I get 115 people who have Accenture somewhere in their profiles. I'm going to click Current Company just for the sake of filtering down. I get 37. Why did I get so many more people at Accenture filtering this way? Well, I didn't put an industry filter. Not everybody remembers to call themselves out as working in a particular industry. They may only put their firm. So it's important to filter different ways to get the maximum number of search results. But if you work it a couple of different times and you get used to using the filters in different ways, you'll figure out how to get access to most of the folks in this population. Okay, let's say I want to now connect with someone at a firm that I'm interested in applying to for the purposes of trying to schedule a coffee chat, for the purposes of trying to schedule an informational interview. Let me go to Alejandra, for example. She has a great Columbia background photo and a nice little summary. So I can read a little bit about her work. She's a co-founder and director of a mentorship program, so she's interested in mentoring. She's a strategy consultant, and so that's again a subset of management consulting that we talked about, I think 2 days ago at this point. And I can read a little bit more about her. So she's been at Accenture for 4 years. She was a political science alum at Barnard, and she was part of SGA, and she was a speaking fellow. Great, so I'm learning a lot, right? Notice that it's not that the only important thing about her is that she's at Accenture. Now, I know that people's first impulse is typically to try to click message. Without LinkedIn Premium, you're not going to be able to message people directly, and that's okay. Don't get Premium. You can do the 30-day free trial, but I'm not a LinkedIn spokesman, though I do love LinkedIn. I would recommend that it's not necessary to pay for LinkedIn. Instead, what I would do is click connect and then add a note. And you have 300 characters then to write a message to Alejandra. And what I would say the most common mistake that I see from Barnard students is that they then think they have to list all of the reasons why they're qualified to talk to this alumna. What I would say instead is focus on them. Or even, sorry, I always futz with this. Keeping track of the number of characters here. Okay, so it doesn't always work out like that it's 0 on the nose. I'm not trying to do magic tricks, but I do this a lot. And I do think you should play around with it. Okay, so notice what I'm doing here is I'm identifying multiple affinities. I'm interested in hearing more. So we're both political science majors, let's say. I'm interested in hearing about her mentorship platform, and I'm saying that her advice would be really helpful. So I'm not talking about Accenture too much. I'm not saying I'm applying there and I need your referral. I'm instead trying to connect on the basis of these shared affinities. I'm going to copy and paste this kind of example message into the chat so you have it. I think that keeping things relatively short, holding yourself to the 300 characters that you're limited to, and focusing on what interests you share with the alumna is the best chance that you'll have to actually get a response. Keep in mind, they may not actually actually message you back in LinkedIn. However, they may accept your connection request, and that's great. If I'm not connected to Alejandra, all I'm gonna get is her LinkedIn profile, and sometimes randomly I get people's birthday. It has to do with your privacy settings. But once I am connected to people on LinkedIn, once they do accept my connection request, I will, here's Allison, have their personal Gmail or whatever email they use to sign up for LinkedIn in their contact info section. Now look, there's another hack here that you can use. All consulting firms, because they are fierce networkers, because they want people to connect, typically have pretty straightforward email formats. So for consulting, and this is not always the case for other industries, you can basically look at Rocket Reach, just basically search what firm plus email format, and figure out, okay, it's first name dot last name at accenture.com. And Rocket Reach will give you the percentages. It doesn't always work out to 100%. So let's say you're not sure, maybe it's first initial dot last name, maybe it's first initial last name. What I suggest in those cases, if you're really having trouble reaching out, is let's say it's ajernstein@barnard.edu. and a.j.arenstein@barnard.edu, and oops, and a.arenstein. Okay, I'm going to put all these in the BCC field, and I'm going to do 2 to myself, or let's say to Beyond Barnard. The email to Beyond Barnard will go through. The correct email will go through to the person that I am trying to network with. The other incorrect BCCs will just bounce away, and I will know which of these is the correct email address to use. This is one way to, it's a hack to email people directly. Okay, let's say they respond, yippee, you have the chance to connect. You're gonna ask for an opportunity to have an informational interview, to have a coffee chat. What does that actually look like? So I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. So, coffee chats. Why are these things so magical? And again, I think, is anyone a Bob's Burgers fan? Please, for the love of God, tell me. No, okay. Well, this is Tina, she's awesome. I suggest Bob's Burgers for sure. Why do consulting companies do these things? Why are they so maniacal about coffee chats? I think that first of all, it's a way to get people in the door in a way that feels informal. So they feel like they're getting more of a real version of you in the informational setting than potentially in a behavioral or formal interview setting. The second is that, like the recruiting activities like outreach on LinkedIn, consulting firms often monetize and incentivize their younger consultants to go out and do these coffee chats and then provide reports into the recruiting team about how candidates, about their initial sense of fitness of particular candidates to the role. And thirdly, I think that it's such a client-driven business that people want to know that you have the capacity to connect informally over a cup of coffee. These things happen very often in Liz's place when they happen on campus. They happen very often at Joe. And we schedule them formally with firms all the time, but essentially any opportunity for you to connect with a consultant is an informational interview or a coffee chat. So the first thing to say about these is that these are your interviews to run. You set the agenda for the conversation. This is not an opportunity to sit back and wait for the consultant or whoever you're talking to ask you questions. You should come ready to set the agenda for the conversation. So I very often suggest that your informational interview, your coffee chat, actually begins about 48 hours before the date. It begins with your, first of all, doing research on the person who you're talking to's LinkedIn profile to read a little bit about their background, to see, again, if you have any affinities that you share in common, to get to know a little bit about their path to consulting. Therefore, you will arrive to the interview with a little bit more specific context about their particular biography to ask about. You should also at this point, this is like so distracting, by the way, I did not intend for Tina to just totally dominate our, sorry guys. I'll just put it on, I'll put it quietly. You should also be doing research on the firm. So this is your opportunity to do a little bit of research on whatever firm the person is working at. Get to know their culture a little bit. Have questions ready to ask about what makes their firm distinctive from others. 12 hours before to 18 hours before the conversation, you should send a confirmation email. Say, hey, I'm really looking forward to our conversation tomorrow. I'll see you at 12 p.m. We're going to use Zoom. I'm happy to send a link, but if you have a preferred platform, we can certainly defer. Let me know if you need to change. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow. These are the things that I was hoping to talk about. A, B, and C. A little bit about your path, a little bit about my background and research in behavioral psychology at Barnard, and I'd love to ask you some questions about your experience at the firm so far. Again, you're setting expectations this way, but you're also doing what is, you got to think like a consultant. Before a big meeting with a client, what are you going to do? You're going to email to firm up the details. You're going to set expectations and the agenda before the conversation even happens. I cannot tell you the number of students that flake on these freaking informational interviews. So if you are following up And, setting expectations 12 hours before, you're already ahead of the game. At the start of the conversation, I want you to forestall the possibility of what I like to call alumni story time. What you don't want to have happen is, let's say you have a 30-minute conversation scheduled. You don't want the person you're talking to tell you their entire life story for 25 minutes, and then in minute 26 say, okay, so tell me about your interest in consulting again, right? This is your time. You have the capacity to, edge your way into the conversation and set the tone. So right at the start of the conversation, I would say something like, so, hey, first of all, I just want to say thank you again for taking time out of your day. I know I sent some talking points last night about what I was hoping to cover, but here's how I thought that we could structure the conversation. I'm happy to give an introduction about myself. I have a couple of questions about your work. I'm really enthusiastic to hear about your time at IBM Consulting so far. And then I thought we could just kind of make sure to set aside time for some next steps and be strategic about follow-ups. Does that sound okay? Right. So Barnard students are really good at this naturally. I love going to SGA. You guys set more rules for meetings than anybody I've ever met. Like, it's a very structured conversation. But I think this is really good practice. This is you showing leadership. You're taking control of the conversation in a respectful way, and it makes sure that you can get to your agenda. And remember, your agenda here is to ask smart questions to get good information that you need, but also obviously to make a good impression. So then you want to ask your questions. What is it appropriate to ask about? I just got a question. Type the structure into the chat box. Venice, can you specify a little bit more? Do you want me the structure of the coffee chat interview? You mean? I'm sorry.
When you talked about like the one you just said just now, when you were like, "Hi, my name is thank you for taking your time out."
Yeah. So I would say, like, very simply, I would start with, thanking them for their time. I would say, on my agenda is to talk a little bit about my background at Barnard. I'd love to ask you some questions about your path from Barnard into consulting and the work that you're doing now. And I thought that we'd save some time for some concrete next steps at the end, just so we can be strategic about follow-up. Venice, did that answer your question? You mean that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. And I'm always happy to slow down. So thanks for slowing me down. I've had too much coffee. Okay, so what do you actually ask in the context of these informational interviews? Look at this. I'm going to correct my own bad news, Dean AJ. So I think, first of all, it's always interesting. You want people to give insight into their path from Barnard into consulting. I think asking questions. Is it really, Roxanne? That's so funny. Sorry, you give implicit permission to have your likeness used in. I saw you just chatted that to me privately. I don't mean to out you. Roxanne's in the picture, y'all. You have implicit permission. You give implicit permission to Barnard to use your likeness when you're on campus at events. So what is surprising about consulting? What has been some of the most challenging of their work? What is their favorite case? And something that I like to do is to frame each question with why you're asking that question. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I get to behavioral interviews. So essentially, what do I mean by this? What I mean is, let's say you want to ask them, tell me about your favorite case. Okay, fine. You're going to get some interesting information about their personal experience with a case that they were on. But if you ask it like this, so I was poking around like a nerd on McKinsey's website, and I saw this really interesting recent case that you guys did actually with a nonprofit organization that I've done work with up in Morningside Heights as part of your pro bono practice. And I just thought it was so interesting to see the way that you're bringing consulting practices into nonprofit spaces. I'd love to hear, first and foremost, a little bit more about any experience you have doing some of those pro bono cases, but more generally, I'd just love to hear about, your favorite case. What was an unexpected favorite encounter that you had in a client? Okay, so that was a little sloppy. You would want to clean that up a little bit, but the main point is this. I am now using my experience and the fact that I have done homework already to frame why I am asking the question. So I'm essentially taking the opportunity to call out something about myself, my experience, and contextualize why I'm asking the question at the same time. So I'm going to get a better answer from that consultant at the same time that I'm using the space of asking the question to say something about myself. Okay. I think there are higher stakes for this, and we're just going to keep vamping on this for a moment. And when we get to behavioral interviews next, I'll kind of restate this. I take a question that matters a lot to Barnard students very often. Can you tell me about opportunities to get a mentor as a woman at your firm? And just asking that question can sound like a challenge or an accusation. People get on the defensive with things like this. There's assumptions that firms don't have resources, et cetera, right? So if you say something like, are there opportunities to find a mentor who is a woman at your firm? Compare that to, so I was poking around on the site and I saw this great mentorship program and where you connect senior associates to entry-level consultants. And I'm sure as a Barnard student, identity is important to me generally, and certainly gender identity is part of that. And I'd love to hear your feedback about your own experience with the mentorship program, or what you know about the capacity to indicate preferences, whether along gender or identity lines when picking a mentor. Right? So again, I'm not asking, do you have this? I'm saying instead, I saw this. Mentorship is important to me. And I hope that you know that just based on the fact that I went to Barnard and I'm constantly thinking about gender as well. So can you say a little bit more about your experience with it and whether I have the capacity to name someone or to express preferences in picking a mentor? Make sense generally? You're trying to basically state some of your preferences, state some of your interests, state some of the things that are important to you and that you've done in the past to help the person you're asking the question answer more fully and answer, I think, more honestly. The last thing is the follow-ups. So with 5 minutes to go in an informational interview, I like to suggest that you say, listen, I want to be mindful of time. I know we're slated for 30 minutes. I thought we might take the last 5 minutes just to kind of follow up and kind of define next steps for our conversation, if that's okay with you. They'll always say yes, right? But you just don't want to, you'll have a fun conversation. It's great to let people give their perspectives, but you also want to walk away from informational interviews with a clear sense of what's next for both of you. How do you want to carry this relationship forward so it's not merely a 30-minute transaction, but it's something that can actually turn into an ongoing conversation? Can you guys still hear me, by the way? I think my internet is going in and out. Great, thanks. What are those concrete follow-ups that you can ask for? What are the concrete asks that you can make? I think there are a couple of really common ones. One is if you really enjoyed the conversation and you think this is someone whose energy you're just kind of vibing with, you can say, listen, as I'm applying this fall, I'm wondering, would you be open to meeting again in a week or two and doing some practice cases? I'd love to just get your feedback on how I'm doing in case prep. Asking for case prep is like the best thing to do, right? Like you can get my feedback all you want, but I'm not a consultant. I feel like I've said that every day. Like getting feedback from actual consultants on your case performance is a really good idea because they are actually doing that work. But B, it shows that you're interested in being prepared. You're interested in doing case interviews. You might even make it sound like it's a fun thing. Like I'd really enjoy the opportunity to just practice cases with you if you have some time to do so. And keep in mind, because they are very often informally, formally involved in recruiting processes, they may be taking notes on this interview that they then share with the recruiting team. They write down, set up case prep. And then after you do your informal case prep, they might say, she did great, ask great questions. I think she'll do great in the second round. So all of these things, are worth it to ask for if you feel comfortable. But I think a really basic ask, and this is especially the case if you're not formally recruiting yet, for any alumna that you're talking to, and again, I think so many of these best practices are portable to other industries, ask, do you mind if I send you my resume? I went to this consulting job documents event, and who knows if this idiot in a hoodie beyond Barnard knew what he was talking about with respect to job documents, but I'd love it to get some of your feedback on my resume. And that's a great way to get your resume in their inbox. It's a great way to get feedback on what you've put together so far. The last part, of course, then is you have to follow up. You have to send an email after the informational interview and say, thank you so much again. As we discussed, X, where X is, I've attached my resume. Thank you so much again for taking a look at it. Or thanks again for talking today. And you mentioned we might set up time to do a case interview. Here are some times that work for me in the next 2 weeks. It would be great to get on the calendar. Make sure to follow up with gratitude, say thanks. In the context of the informational interview itself, always get a business card. If you don't know the person already, if you are meeting virtually, it's obviously not possible. Just make sure you have a good way of following up. But say thank you. You'd be surprised how few people, I mean this from personal experience. I just did an informational interview with a not Barnard person yesterday. She sent me a super lovely thank you note, called something out specific, reminded me what I needed to follow up with her on. It was perfect. It was almost like she had attended this presentation. Okay, so in the remaining time, I want to give you some strategies and structures for planning for behavioral interviews. And again, these are really important in the context of consulting recruiting. They're often the first round. You might sometimes be doing this via phone, even in times when we have the opportunity to meet in person. These are very often phone interviews. They may otherwise be virtual interviews. And more consulting firms were conducting their first round interviews via virtual platforms anyway, even before COVID. So again, make a plan. First thing to say is this is an interview, not an interrogation. So I think that the more you can practice these skills, the more you can get used to interviews being more like conversations and not expect that it's just the interviewer's responsibility to get information out of you and for you to repeat your pre-recorded, rehearsed answers, the better. Interviews work best when they don't feel like interviews, when they feel like conversations and exchange between two parties who are just interested in getting to know each other. Questions that you should definitely prep for. The first is tell us about yourself. Sometimes in consulting behavioral interview contexts, they might say something like, can you walk us through your resume and pick a couple of bullet points that are important to you? This is essentially the same question asked in a different way with a different expected structure. But in either case, tell us about yourself or walk us through your resume is not an opportunity for you to say whatever you want about those experiences. You should always be thinking about answering that question with an eye to the specific context of the behavioral interview and the firm that you're interviewing at. What does that look like actually? I'll tell you. So I like to start with Barnard. I like to say, first of all, I like to say thanks again for taking the time to chat with me today. As you know, my name's AJ. I'm a senior at Barnard College where I major in psychology and economics, and you're off. And it's kind of the same structure as the summary on LinkedIn. You know, as a senior, I'm writing a thesis that explores structural inequality and effects on behavioral psychology among K through 12 students. I've paired this research with an internship at the Bank Street School of Education, which is right down the block from Barnard. And I have to say, I became interested in consulting how, right? So notice I'm not talking like I wasn't born in Mount Vernon, New York, though I was. I didn't grow up, in Westchester, though I did. I didn't go to high school on the Upper East Side. It was a really long commute, and I got used to trains. All of that's true. I'm starting from the specific context. You have to understand what contextualizing information is important to the interviewer, and it's really who you are right now and how you got there. So think about the information that's in your cover letter. Think about the information that you're sharing in your LinkedIn profile, and think about a version of introducing yourself that is about 35 seconds to a minute long. This is your elevator pitch. We do advising just on this at Beyond Barnard. So for those of you who want to kind of like hone your pitch, we're totally happy to do that. We do it all the time. But when you get to I often find when I first rehearse this with students, often these just kind of peter out. I think it's important to say things like, I'm especially drawn to firms like BCG because, because of the reputation that you all have for hypothesis-driven consulting that really aligns with my scientific background. So even in your introduction to yourself, you can wed what you're about with what they're about. But often these answers peter out, and if you've been in this situation, I'm holding hands with you virtually right now because I've been there too. And it just ends with like, so yeah, that's kind of me. What I like to suggest as a nice way to finish off a behavioral interview, tell us about yourself question, is to say something like, so thanks again for taking the time. I'm really excited to have this conversation and to just have the opportunity to get to know you all a little bit better. So what does that do? It ends you on an up note. It ends you with gratitude. So no matter if you flubbed during your description of your research on tsetse flies or whatever you research at Barnard, you're ending on a positive. You're saying thank you. You're expressing enthusiasm to be part of the conversation. And that's good. Leaves a good impression right from the start, or it makes a good impression right from the start. So the second thing, strengths and weaknesses. How have you achieved on a team, or how have you solved a difficult problem? All of these are variations on questions that you might be asked in a behavioral interview situation. And to start to tackle these questions, I'm not going to go deeply into detail with all of these today, but instead I am going to suggest that you approach answers to these questions using what's typically called the STAR method. It's super boring and cliche in most of its representations. I'm going to try to jazz it up for you to help you. I'm going to use jazz hands as I'm talking about it to help you get organized and potentially excited about structuring your answers this way. The STAR method is essentially situation, task, action, and result. And here's how it breaks down. A situation you can think of as a scene, as an overall picture. So let's say I want to describe a course situation where, as a leader in a lab group, I was challenged to produce a presentation for a class project, and I'm in charge of the team. So the situation would be the class itself. So you would open by saying, so I think I'm going to draw from a psychology class back in my junior year, leading up to my thesis work in my senior year. It's a class on behavioral psychology, and it's one of the fundamental cornerstones of doing advanced research at Barnard. And in this class, we are all assigned to lead a group project. So I want to talk about leading that group project. That's the scene. That's the general context. Okay, the task is what was your role in that scene. So in the context of our project, my task as a leader was essentially to get 5 different people together, to get them oriented on a week-long behavioral, essentially an ethnographic survey of 10 people, to get a presentation created, and then to deliver that presentation by the following week. That's my task as the leader of that team. What's actions? Actions are the steps that you took in order to accomplish that task. Okay, so in order to get going, the very first thing that I do as a leader is always to understand whose strengths fit best to which parts of the project. So my first step as a leader is to assess people's strengths and to try to assign them to the task that I think that they can accomplish during the week. The second thing is to actually conduct the experiment. And to do that, we went out into the field and led 5 different behavioral batteries with groups of students that had been pre-identified. The final part is analyzing the data that we collected to actually code the words. And in order to accomplish this task, what I did was actually run the code through Python. I don't know anything about all of these things, but you're breaking up the task that you have to do into its constitutive steps. And then finally you say, and as a result, we were able to deliver a presentation the following week that not only got us a great grade, obviously, which is always important, but I think that one of the results that was unexpected was that we came together as a group, that we all were able to get this task accomplished in a manner that leveraged our particular strengths while making up for each other's weaknesses. Notice that my results aren't necessarily just quantitative here, they're also qualitative. They're about my leadership and how we came together as a group. The reason I think STAR is so effective for consulting is because it basically overstructures your answers to questions in a manner that looks like consulting work. Situation, task, action, result is another way of asking or describing what consultants do. Recall that I keep coming back to this definition of consultative work. Situation is assessing or understanding a problem. The task is to understand that problem. The action is the kind of, the analysis that you do to understand that problem. And the result is the presentation to the clients that stands as the recommendation for addressing the problem. So you don't need to memorize tons of different stories when you're thinking about answers to behavioral interview questions using this structure. Instead, you might think of the same story, but think about different results or different actions that you took or different tasks. So my story about succeeding on a team, delivering this presentation of research, might also be a story about how I overcame obstacles on a team. I might use this same situation and drill into a part of the drama of that situation that was, we had a big problem when the data didn't match up. So the situation is the same. We're doing this big research project. The tasks are the same. Everybody has to do this thing. But drama. There literally is like a car accident outside. There's just a screech out my window. It was very dramatic for me. But drama. Our data didn't match up. And so suddenly, my task as a leader became fixing this problem. In order to do so, I did this, Y, and Z, and as a result, X. I can tell the same story, use the same context, but use this structure to produce a different kind of answer. Okay? And again, practicing behavioral interviews is like bread and butter for Beyond Barnard. So we call these star stories. You are welcome to come in and practice them. And they can, I really want to be clear about this, come from class, they can come from internships, they can come from leadership activities and extracurriculars. What matters is not that you feel that it's too studenty. What matters is your capacity to translate what you did in student work and extracurriculars for the particular audience of the consultants you'll be sitting with. The final thing here, I want to get back to questions for them, like I said. And as I intimated, a lot of my advice about questions for them comes from my perspectives on how to do well in informational interviews and coffee chats. So another reason to really get going on networking and connecting with individuals for those kinds of conversations is that it can help you produce really good questions for behavioral interview scenarios. So questions for a consultant in a first round, just be careful, it's not stuff that you can find on the website. Like, don't ask them about their benefits, don't ask them about salaries, don't ask them about, that's too soon for all of that, right? That will be worked out over the course of several interview rounds. What you want to ask them about is, I've done a lot of research on multiple boutique strategy firms. And I've looked at lots of different ways that folks address particularly marketing problems on social media right now. And I found this great case at, I don't know, blah, blah, blah consulting, where you guys did this really interesting project that created a social campaign for relationship violence awareness. And I'd love to just kind of talk with you about what made the culture of the firm really a good fit for that case. What do you think the elements of the firm culture that aligned with that case were most important? Right, so again, questions for them are about contextualizing your question, saying something about yourself, and then asking for data, for information that's actually meaningful to helping you understand the firm a little bit better. So that's my spiel today. I'm going to end on that note. I'm going to also, bye everybody watching at home. We'll see you tomorrow for case interviews. But for now, I'm going to break it off for questions for those of you who are here. So I'm going to hit stop. Good evening to those of you not here.